For someone whose favorite Resident Evil game is 1999's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Capcom's latest remake had been a highly anticipated release. Jill Valentine's nightmarish escape from Raccoon City was a great thrill ride in the late PlayStation 1 era, and the same holds true for 2020's retelling of this classic survival horror. While the remake isn't a perfect one-to-one translation of the original events, it's still a fantastic game in its own right that shouldn't be missed by any fan of the genre. Resident Evil 3 is yet another example of the power behind Capcom's RE engine. Not only does it feature stunning visuals with gnarly detail, it also runs fluently at high frame rates during even the most involved action scenes. The new version of Raccoon City is a great blend of classic Resident Evil style death, rot and decay on one hand, and neon-lit storefronts next to burning piles of vehicles on the other. It's perhaps the most visually striking and memorable setting in the series and serves as a wonderful backdrop for Jill's panic-filled quest to survive. As with the original, however, only about 40% of the game actually takes place in the streets of Raccoon City. Numerous other settings are thrown into the mix for the sake of visual and thematic variety as well. On that front, it's worth noting that the remake omits 2 areas from the original, which has many fans disgruntled. It makes up for that, however, by introducing a new environment and expanding other locations that were only minor sections in the 1999 version. 2 examples are the hospital and the sewers, the former being elevated to a whole new level of gruesome atmosphere, and the latter ending up less tiresome and more tightly paced than the sewers in Resident Evil 2. There's also a brief excursion to a construction site, which is another welcome and fitting addition. Still, the 2 notable omissions are disappointing to longtime Raccoon City survivors. Resident Evil 3 deviates more from its source material than last year's remake as far as the setting goes, but that doesn't mean that this restructuring is inherently inferior. If anything, the new version offers an alternate take on the same premise with equally great level design. Much like the PlayStation 1 game, its remake doesn't take long to finish. Even a first playthrough is unlikely to surpass the 6-hour mark, which is roughly the length of a single scenario in Resident Evil 2. At first glance, the third remake in the series seems to compare highly unfavorably to its predecessor when it comes to playtime. It's worth remembering though that there is a large amount of overlap and repetition between the 4 scenarios in the 2019 game. Resident Evil 3 offers about half the total content of its peer. For some players, this brief campaign may not be worth the full price of admission. Others, however, may find enjoyment in replaying the game over and over, which Resident Evil 3 incentivizes via a good amount of unlockable items and upgrades, as opposed to separate campaigns that are largely identical but do feature some differences. But as fun as it is to race through Raccoon City again and again with an increasingly more impressive arsenal of weapons, the most important factor when incentivizing multiple playthroughs of any game has always been the innate quality of said game. Resident Evil 3 certainly knows how to impress on that front. Jill controls much like Claire and Leon did a year ago, being able to sprint and to perform a 180-degree quick turn, which the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis introduced to the series back in the day. Another introduction from the same game also makes its return here, the dodge mechanic. In this new iteration of the game, dodging is quite a bit more accessible and easier to execute than it was originally. However, the timing isn't overly lenient and proper positioning is of importance as well. A mistimed evasion attempt can make things much worse for Jill, which means that there's an inherent risk to using the tactic. At the same time though, this mechanic allows skillful players to achieve a high level of mastery over the game that can leave enemies in the dust and any viewers on Twitch or other platforms stunned. Dodging is an especially nice addition to Resident Evil 3 because the game has a higher focus on tense action than Resident Evil 2. The game can have a lot of enemies on screen and is overall a bit more linear in comparison. That being said, the exploration factor isn't abandoned entirely. The game's structure still harkens back to the classic Resident Evil style of map design, but finding the correct path forward and discerning how, when and where to interact with the environment is easier than in Resident Evil 1 and 2. A smaller portion of the game is played as Carlos Oliveira, a member of Umbrella's biohazard countermeasure service. Rather than dodging, he's able to shoulder tackle enemies, sending them flying and buying the player ample opportunity to readjust. He and Jill Valentine, who's part of the Raccoon City Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, have to team up to escape from the hordes of undead that are causing mayhem in the streets. Unfortunately though, their job is made excruciatingly difficult by someone very special who's hell-bent on stopping Jill's escape. In order to erase all evidence and witnesses that are able to link Umbrella with the creation of the T-Virus, the bioweapon developer disguised as a pharmaceutical company has created an especially dangerous and tenacious foe known only as the Nemesis. The parasite-infused Tyrant-class zombie's one and only mission is to eliminate Jill Valentine, the only member of STARS left alive and present in Raccoon City after the phenomenal new intro sequence. The Nemesis is smart enough to use weaponry like flamethrowers and rocket launchers and chases Jill over the course of the whole game. In concept, it's essentially a more sophisticated and deadlier version of Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, that is, at least in lore. It's a little unfortunate that, during gameplay, the Nemesis is essentially relegated to a handful of isolated escape sequences that are fun and intense in their own right, but don't quite compensate for the lack of a more dynamic threat. Outside of these scripted sequences, the player never has to worry about suddenly running into their pursuer like it was the case in Resident Evil 2. Still, the iconic Super Zombie is a frightening opponent and arguably makes for some of the best boss fights in the entire Resident Evil series. Rather than just overcoming a glorified bullet sponge that does a lot of damage up close, Jill actually needs to deal with additional gameplay mechanics when facing off against her nemesis. The encounters aren't exactly complex, but they do have more to them than the typical Resident Evil boss fight. They feel more gamey, so to speak, and in a good way. Just like the 2019 remake, Resident Evil 3 suffers a little from some unimpressive weapon sounds, with the Magnum being particularly disappointing. The soundtrack, in contrast, does a fantastic job of building tension and ramping up over the course of the game. There aren't any catchy tunes here, but the blend of distorted strings, menacing drums and subtle electronic beats here and there really gets the survival instincts going, which is more than fitting for a game in which the whole point is to get the hell out of Raccoon City. 2020's Resident Evil 3 is the second entry in this new style of Resident Evil that combines modern third-person controls and shooting with the classic level design of the 1990s, which at this point might just prove to be the strongest gameplay style the franchise has offered to date. The game offers less content than 2019's Resident Evil 2, but it further improves on the core gameplay with more fun boss fights and the awesome dodge mechanic. While the game might not be worth the full price of admission to everyone, those who do invest can look forward to a fantastic action-packed survival horror game that stands shoulder to shoulder with the greatest Resident Evils ever made.